Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 11th and tonight's movie is Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Just to clarify, I'm not watching the 1956 version, I'm just watching the remake from 1978. When it comes to alien-based horror movies, this is definitely one of the first that comes to mind, even though it was definitely overshadowed in cultural impact by that other alien-themed sci-fi horror movie about 6 months later. This is one of the very few horror remakes that actually was received well, and some might even say was better than the original. There's another horror remake coming up later this month that got a bit more of a mixed reaction, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Anyway, this movie, it has some pretty big actors in it, like Donald Sutherland, Leonard Nimoy, and Jeff Goldblum. But I won't front, the trailer doesn't make it seem like a movie that you should take all that seriously. The vibe I got is that of a campy B-movie. Though that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Evil Dead 2 was very campy, and I like that a lot. But that's assuming that this movie is a campy movie. It might be totally serious. Let me go find out. I've been surprised by a lot of movies so far this month, but this wasn't one of them. It was about as good as I expected it to be. I'm giving Invasion of the Body Snatchers a 5 out of 10. This movie was kind of dumb. I think the biggest problem with it is that it kind of walked the line between a movie that's like campy and silly and a movie that's serious, and it tried to have it both ways and it didn't really work out as either. The effects do hold up surprisingly well though. I think there was some stop motion in there was some good practical effects, there was like a lot of really good visuals in this movie. The invasive alien species is more in the form of a plant than an animal. It's like this seed pod that makes a flower. And without going into detail, anybody who gets that flower ends up like the next day acting very strangely. The movie describes them as not acting like they have any emotions at all. One thing I noticed is that the acting in this movie is not that good. And I know that these are good actors, so I'm more inclined to blame the director. Like, there are some lines that sounded like they were delivered by aliens before the characters were turned into aliens. The setup is interesting enough, but the pacing of this movie is pretty slow. There were a lot of scenes that were so quiet and uneventful, I was expecting a jump scare to happen, but no, that's just how the scene went. It is really scary in concept, the idea of this silent coup of humanity from inside out, but the aliens aren't exactly sneaky about it. Pretty much everybody who's close to the person who is taking over can catch on that something's wrong. Overall, while this movie had a great idea, the execution was just kind of boring in my opinion. The pacing was slow, the acting wasn't that good. There were incredible effects, and when this movie wanted to be like really impressive with its visuals, it was. But overall, it's not silly enough to be campy, and it's not serious enough to be legitimately scary. I want to talk about some spoilers now. I will say that the visual effects that they gave for the plants made them look so disgusting and unnatural. I thought that it was like a parasite that like comes into the brain and like controls the body, but what it does is that it like steals DNA from the person, then it makes this gigantic disgusting flower sac and like births out these weird hairy fibery masses that like slowly coalesce into a human form. And apparently, when the person who's being copied goes to sleep, they'll wither away and die, and that's when the like clone will like wake up and start living its life as the original person. As for the human characters fighting back against the invasion, it's kind of a lost cause. By the time they figure out what's going on, it's already too late. At that point, they've already put the entire city on lockdown. Nobody can go in or out without being screened. They have mobs of imposters walking the streets, ready to track down anybody who is still a human, and they are mass producing these pods that create the doppelgangers. However, there is a way to trick them. If you just don't display any sort of emotion at all, they'll think you're one of them, which I think is kind of an oversight. That seems like a pretty exploitable thing. And then this movie hit me with one of the stupidest things I've seen in a while. There was this like minor character, I don't even think they named him, like this guy who sits on a curb with his dog playing the banjo. They get taken by the pods, and then later on in the movie, when the two main characters, or well, it was three characters, were trying to blend in with the pod people, that dog with that human's head comes up and scares one of the women. and that effect did not look very good. It was just, it was dumb. It was a dumb moment. There's this long chase scene that really isn't as exciting as you'd expect. It's actually very slow and repetitive. Eventually, the main character, played by Donald Sutherland, is able to destroy a lot of the seeds that are being mass-produced, but it clearly isn't enough to stop everything. And then it ends with him going back to the city, walking amongst the pod people, and then he sees one of the other characters who was able to successfully blend in, and then the iconic moment where she's like, "Hey, it's me! I'm so glad I was able to find you!" And then he does the thing that all the pod people do when they see a human, which is that they point, and then they screech. And I know that they wanted it to be scary, but it just looked and sounded kind of silly. I'm underwhelmed by this movie. I wasn't expecting brilliance from it, but I was expecting a little bit more than what I got. The visual effects were ahead of its time. They look good by today's standards. But the rest of the movie is kind of middle of the road. Thank you for listening. I'll see you tomorrow.